Welcome to the Wayne Bennett Podcast, celebrating West Virginia's people, places, and the culture of Southern Appalachia. Now here's your host, Wayne Bennett.
Welcome to Wayne Bennett's podcast. My name is Wayne Bennett. I'm your host. It is November 2022. We are in our 21st month of our podcast. And a lot of times on the interviews that we have, I've asked people to, what's on your bucket list, or what's on your list to do, or what are we going to do? And I'm a person that makes a lot of lists, and we have bucket lists, we have to-do lists, we have checklists, grocery lists, we have Christmas list, guest list. There was even a Schindler's List that no one wants to be on, I don't think. But I'm also asked the same question. You know, people will ask me, well, who you think was the best athlete at Woodrow Wilson High School, or who's the band you like the best? So I sat down the other day and started making out a list, and each one of my lists includes 5 subjects or people. And when I started making one, all of a sudden, one became another and another and another. And so I had several lists, and I want to share these with you. And these are not included to offend anyone. Maybe you might want to be on the list, or maybe you don't want to be on the list. Who knows? But I started out locally. A lot of people that listen to our podcast are Woodrow Wilson High School graduates. And I got to thinking, well, of course, football's big at Woodrow, and who were the best football players that ever played at Woodrow Wilson High School? And, you know, they've had some history back in the past, but the ones who made my list, Walt Rappold, who played this is a junior, who played back in the 50s, went on and played at Duke University. Chris Gross, who played at Woodrow in the 90s and had a great career down at Marshall. Of course, Doug Legursky, who also played at Marshall and also played pro ball. Mike Ross, who played in the 80s, and he ended up playing at Concord, and then he also played in the UFL. Then the fifth name was kind of hard to come up with. Bob Pruitt, Clint Van Horn, Chase Hancock, Mike Williams. But I guess if I had to pick one, I would have picked Clint Van Horn, who had a good career at Woodrow and then played at Marshall, and then actually had an invitation to the New Orleans Saints. Of course, then if you go from football, you got to go to basketball. And what a livid, great history that Woodrow Wilson has had in basketball. To pick the top 5, you're really going to leave out a lot of players, great players. But my top 5 is Howard Hurt, played in the 50s, and went on to play at Duke. Dwayne Wingler, who I never actually saw play, but I've heard people say that he was one of the best in basketball and football. And there's a lot of great stories about him. Bain Surratt, who played on the 1962 undefeated team that averaged almost 25 points a game, and he basically shot what would have been later called a three-pointer. If they would have had a three-point shot back when he played, they'd still be chasing his records. Also think Ryan Colcerto, who played in the 1990s, that helped Beckley win a couple state championships, and then Tamar Slay, who played at Marshall and then played in pro ball. Tamar's still very active in basketball. But those are my 5, and I'm sure that you've got some ideas about who your 5 would be. Staying with Beckley, baseball. Baseball's a tough one. Of course, times I grew up, Steve Licklider and Chubby Hughes would be on my list. And both of them played college ball, had some pro offers. Big Andy Wakefield would be on my list. He was played catcher and first base, and Dave Parkalow was a very outstanding athlete. Then there you go. The 5th one would be kind of difficult. You got a couple of Mayolas there, Larry Mayola and Mike Mayola, who were really good. But if Lee Blair, Matt Coker, I mean, there's a bunch of guys that would, Mike Mullins, guys like that would be around the 5th. But if I had to pick one, I would pick Brandon Gravely, who was All-State and then went on and had a pretty good career at baseball school, Delaware State. Wrestling would be a little bit easier for me. If I picked at Woodrow Wilson, I would have picked Mike Teacock, who wrestled back in the 50s, a two-time state champion, and John Summers. Then later in the 80s would be Chet Toney. Chet was a state champion who was kind of a man among boys in his weight class, is very good. Marvin Lawson also wrestled in the 80s. He would be on my list. And the last one, the fifth one, would be a new kid that just won a state championship, still at Woodrow Wilson, Jimmy Bales. He won a state championship as a ninth grader, has an opportunity to do something nobody else has ever done, and that's win 3 or 4 state championships at Woodrow Wilson High School. And so it'll be interesting. I don't know in the track. I would say definitely Tom Reed, Jeff Adkins, who was a great distance and middle distance runner. A couple girls on there, Stephanie Orlon, Micah Aileen, who had a great career at Marshall University. And then the fifth person be anywhere from Mike Brown, Vernon Knight, Chris Barbera. If I had to pick one, I would take Mike Brown, I guess. But all those guys are outstanding athletes, and there are others. And I don't know a lot about the girls' sports, so it'd be hard for me to pick anything in volleyball or softball. Girls' basketball, if I was going to pick my list at Woodrow Wilson High School, I would have to put Stacy Cantley, who was big in the post, went on and played at Virginia Tech. A girl named Ashley Blaney, who was outstanding. Erin Reynolds, I watched her come all the way up from Mabscott to Park Junior High to Woodrow Wilson High School. And Melissa Gross, who was good at everything. And Kamisha Alexander, who was an outstanding basketball player and went to Concord, I think, and played down there. So those would be on my list as outstanding girls. If you think, staying locally, if I was since I'm more familiar with wrestling, let's go to Liberty High School. I think the 5 best wrestlers that have been at Liberty High School have been Steve Kinley, Adam Lewis, Nick Hilton, Mike Carpenter, Dan Carpenter, his brother. Of course, Nick won a couple state championships. Steve Kinley's won a couple state championships. And all those guys had outstanding careers. 2 or 3 of them went on to college and wrestled. If you go to Shady Springs, of course, they've had a pretty long history of wrestlers too. But the 5 that I think were the best wrestlers at Shady Springs in those years would be David Farley. He was the first 3-time state champion. And then Derek Scarborough, who wrestled in the early 2000s. Kenny McMillan, who also was an outstanding coach later on. Mason Epperly was a 2-time state champion back in the 60s. And Josh Neal. And Josh Neal went on his senior year, moved to Parkersburg, and got in the finals of the state, but he was a 2-time state champion also. So, of course, Independence has had a bevy of state champions, and it's really difficult to pick out the top 5, but you got to go by the number of titles. And, of course, Jacob Hart was a 4-time state champion, which is very rare. His uncle, Jeremy Hart, was a Dutton Award winner, and of course went on and had an outstanding college career at Appalachian State. Noah Adams was a 3-time state champion and also a college All-American. Robert Rash was one of the first multiple winners, and then a guy by the name of Connor Gibson, and more recent, was a very good wrestler. So those would be my top top 5 as far as wrestling at Independence High School. Other categories that people have talked to me about and asked questions, well, what's your favorite movie? Well, in a heartbeat, I would, my five favorite movies, also a lot of other people's favorites, would be Forrest Gump, The Wizard of Oz. I watch 3 or 4 times a year. Shawshank Redemption is another one that I enjoy. The Godfather. My wife gets on to me because I watch it over and over, and I like the first one the best. And Cool Hand Luke are my favorites. That's on my list. There's a lot of others that I enjoy. If I went to actors and actresses, like Paul Newman, I like Tom Hanks, of course, Liz Taylor. A lot of people don't think Liz Taylor was that good, but I've seen her in several different movies. I always thought she was decent. Morgan Freeman and Jack Nicholson, they're right there, but you can't leave Meryl Streep off the list. She's probably one of the best actresses that's ever lived and played so many different roles. And so she would be on my list. If you went to songs, music, the top 5 in my music groups would be the Beatles, of course. Can't leave the Beatles off. And I remember the first time I ever heard of the Beatles, we were out on the playground at Sylvia School in 62 or 63, I think. And somebody asked me if I was going to watch Ed Sullivan's show. The Beatles were going to be on there. And I'd never heard of the Beatles. But I always watched the Ed Sullivan show on Sunday nights and said, well, if they're going to be on there, I'm going to watch them. And that was the first. And I liked the Rolling Stones would be on my list. The Eagles. Of course, the Eagles without Glenn Frey and Don Henley are not the Eagles. But the Beach Boys had such an impact on music back in those days, too. I couldn't leave them off my list. Number 5 on my group, I grew up liking Motown music, but also like Chicago. So the Four Tops in Chicago. If I had to pick one, I'd take the Four Tops just for historical significance, I guess. Now, I said the Beatles, we can't leave them off. I didn't like all the Beatles songs. I didn't like when they got into or Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Band. I didn't particularly like those songs too much, but the top 5, I will take one of the early ones. I Want to Hold Your Hand. The ones I really liked, Beatles songs, were Hey Jude, Imagine, written by John Lennon, Yesterday, and then the song Something. And those would be my favorites. As far as rock individuals, you can't leave, of course, Elvis Presley, Michael Jackson. Has got to be one of the greatest entertainers that ever lived. Sad about the way his life ended. On my list would be James Brown. Again, we got a little Motown rock there. Very entertaining. Jimmy Buffett and Billy Joel. Those guys are still performing and have been for many years and still entertaining millions and millions of people. However, I've kind of started liking country music more than any other type of music. Now, I basically listen to the classic country. And if I had to make a list for the best country singers, of course, George Jones. Some say the Possum is the best. And Merle Haggard, the Hag, you can't leave him off of there. He's my favorite writer, I think. Dolly Parton, Loretta Lynn, who just passed away. The 5th one, I would probably go along with Alan Jackson, but I do like Blake Shelton, Kenny Chesney. Don't like a lot of the modern country singers, but those two are two that I would. As far as female singers, I mentioned, of course, Dolly and Loretta in country. Bonnie Raitt is, I could listen to Bonnie Raitt all day. And not only is she one of the best singers, she's one of the best musicians to play the guitar and slide guitar as good as anybody. Carole King, her album Tapestry back in the 70s was second to none. I always liked Stevie Nicks, their album Rumors. Janis Joplin, her music was raw and entertaining. Also liked Ann Wilson of Heart. She's got one of the best voices that I've ever heard. So that covers those categories. Then another very common question I get, well, who's your favorite baseball player? Or who do you think is the best baseball player? Well, baseball has been over 100 years old, and you start looking back, and I never saw a lot of those players play, of course, but I've seen some. But if I had to list five, if I put five on my list, of course, Babe Ruth, can't leave the big Bambino out. Mickey Mantle, if Mickey Mantle would have stayed healthy, I think you would have had numbers that still would never be matched. I always liked Nolan Ryan, the pitcher. He was hardcore, he was disciplined, and he was very talented. Pete Rose, in my opinion, should be in the Hall of Fame. I don't think he'll ever be there in my lifetime anyway, or his lifetime, but I think eventually somebody might get him in there. And then I always liked Hank Aaron. Hank Aaron just kind of quietly put up great numbers and event. He was definitely an ambassador for baseball, and I like him. There's a lot of baseball players didn't make my list, but these I would argue for. I'm not much of a pro wrestling fan, but my youngest son is, and so I've been subjected to pro wrestling. The top five on my list would be, of course, Ric Flair, Hulk Hogan, Stone Cold Steve Austin, and the Undertaker. And I wasn't real familiar with the Undertaker, but the last one would not be on most people's list as one of the best. But I always liked Dusty Rhodes. He and I were born on the same date, and Hard Times, The American Dream, Dusty Rhodes made my list. Of course, my list can change. There's none of these are etched in steel or concrete, so anything could happen, anything could change. The same way NASCAR is kind of the same way with pro wrestling. I like to watch the beginning and the end of NASCAR races, and that's about it. But if I had to make a list, Richard Petty, Dale Earnhardt, Jimmy Johnson, Jeff Gordon, and the last one would be David Pearson. And I like David Pearson because he used to come over to Prosperity. He'd stop on the way somewhere and race. And sometimes he would just come in and they'd put him in a strange car, a local car, first time ever in it. And you could just tell the professionalism, how good he was, because here he would be in a new car, run a couple laps, warm up, and he would compete, and he'd win, or he would be right up in there. And so that right there kind of tells you what a pro he was, and he was very good. The last list, probably one of the most controversial ones, it would be the pro basketball, the top five. And I've seen these argued all the time. And my top five would be LeBron James, Michael Jordan. Those are easy. I think Kareem Jabbar, Lou Alcindor, back when I was growing up, would have to be listed. And then I would have Jerry West on my list. A lot of people would not have him on there. Because we're not talking about stats or anything. We're talking about individual lists. And the fifth one, would be between Kobe Bryant, Larry Bird, and Bill Russell. And, of course, Bill Russell was more noted for his defensive style and his championship rings. But if I had to pick one of those, I would pick Kobe Bryant. And I have many more lists, but I'm not going to bore you with those things. But if you want to challenge or you want to bring up an argument with the list, hit me up on Facebook, Wayne Bennett's Podcast, and see what changes you would make. And we'll be glad to hear from you. You can have your own list. We'll put it on there also. But it's been fun, and my wife makes fun of me because I carry a yellow pad with me around about all the time, and I'm all the time making a list on schedules and those kind of things. So she says she's going to put a yellow pad in my casket when I pass away, so I'll be sure I have something wherever I go and be able to make lists when I get there. But I appreciate you listening, and remember, if you want to be on the show, you can contact me at awbennett@gmail.com or hit me up on Facebook, and we'll get you scheduled. And remember, if you're not dead yet, you're not done yet. And until next time, God bless you.